Is the screen showing?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So we've had a little bit of bumps in the road along the way. We started off with orientation. We talked about location. We talked about soils and composting. Today we're going to talk about raised beds and container gardens. So as all of you know, most of us have really bad clay soil. And if you've ever tried to grow anything in it, it's not the easiest thing to dig in, or it actually is full of nutrients. So it's not like it's nutrient poor, but it's not the ideal situation if you're trying to get out there and dig a hole or plant a garden. So when that happens, raised beds and containers are often a better choice for us because they're a lot easier to work with and to get things to grow in for us. So some things that we're going to consider today is think about how much room you have for a garden. Think about how much time you want to devote to a garden. Raised beds and containers are a lot easier to keep the weeds out and to keep things going. How many people will be eating from your garden, and what types of fruits and vegetables would you like to grow? We often talk about the fact that there are certain vegetables that are pretty expensive at the grocery store, but are actually pretty easy to grow. So you might think about some of those things. An example of that is some herbs. Some herbs are in upwards of $2 to $3 an herb, or for a little package of them at the grocery store. And most herbs actually grow very, very easily in raised beds and containers. So why use raised beds? Raised beds are popular for community and backyard gardens, especially in areas where the soil is very compact or where the drainage is poor. And both of those things apply to our soils. Our soils are very compact. They're hard clay. They're Victoria clay, actually. And the drainage can often be poor. So that's a good reason why you might use raised beds or containers. So the first thing you want to do is select a spot. Do you guys recall how many hours of sunlight I said it takes for you to be able to grow vegetables?
8?
6 to 8. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a sunny location is preferred. So that's the first thing you want to do, is figure out what your location is going to be. And we walked through your facilities and established that you had one location that was really good for vegetables and fruit trees and stuff, and another location that you might want to be more of like a tropical type garden. Mm-hmm. Then you have to get out there and remove the existing vegetation if you're going to be planting in the ground. If you're putting in raised beds, if you have time, you can put a tarp down and you can put bricks or rocks or boards on top of it, and the tarp will actually, with the aid of the sun, will kill out the grass or the vegetation underneath. I'm not advising that you have to get out there with a pair of scissors and clip away everything. So I just think it's a funny picture. So. And then you have to decide how you want to build the bed. There are lots of different materials that raised beds can be built of. Probably the simplest are to use pressure treated lumber, but I've seen people make beds out of these cinder blocks, and they actually come out really nice. And then if you are trying for a more upscale look, you can use the stackable stones and build them with that. But there's no end to what you can use to create your beds with. I've seen even old rubber tires used for planters before. So, and even bathtubs and things like that. Somebody told me the other day they had an old flat bottom boat that was no longer being used for fishing, and they filled it up with soil, put holes in the bottom of it, filled it up with soil, and used that for a planter. So you can get pretty creative with what you use for your beds. So we're going to go with probably the simplest, and that is to use lumber. The things that you would need to create a bed: you need 3 8-foot boards. One of those is going to get cut in half and will serve as the 2 end pieces. I prefer to use 2x12s, but they're pretty heavy and they're also pretty expensive. So 2x10s will also work. We need to have at least 8 to 12 inches of soil when it's all said and done, though. You're going to need 20 to 30 cubic feet of soil. It might surprise you to find out that the soil in most of the time building beds is the most expensive part of the project. If you think about what a big bag of potting soil costs, you're going to need about 12 of those. So it can be upwards of $100 to $150 just for the soil. And then at 3.5 inch to 4 inch deck screws. And again, you're going to cut one of those boards in half and use those for the 2 end pieces. You also need to think about how you're going to irrigate your raised beds or your containers. You can go all the way with the very sophisticated irrigation system, or you can do something as simple as drip irrigation, or even those little soaker hoses and put those on top and just turn it on whenever you need to do it. Or if you're only dealing with 1 or 2 raised beds, it's always acceptable to just water them by hand. The first step, we always suggest that you put down some cardboard, but I have found if I use a double layer of weed block that it works well. I usually will cut the weed block and put it down on the ground and then build the frame on top of the weed block. And then we'll go ahead and put a second layer of weed block and staple it to the inside of the frame. So you've got a double layer of weed block, and that seems to be working very well. After you have all the weed block in place, then you're going to begin to add the soil. And then you decide what do you want to plant in it? Do you want vegetables, herbs, or a combination? It's also perfectly acceptable to add some flowers in there if you want your beds not only to be productive for vegetables, but also to add a little bit of beauty to the location. How to keep seeds from washing away. You can make what is called seed tape. You can use just about any type of paper towels. If you have those old adding machine rolls, you guys remember those?
Mm-hmm.
They work really well, and you'll need some Elmer's water soluble glue. And all you do is look to see what the spacing is on the packet. If it says every 6 inches, then you'll put a dot of glue every 6 inches, and then you'll sprinkle the seeds over it and then tap it to shake off the excess seeds. And once you're ready to plant, you just go out there and you bury that under the soil. And it makes it where they come out perfectly spaced. There's an example of making a grid and how if you wanted to have a square of seeds, how you could do that. But a lot of times we're trying to just get a long linear row of seeds that are planted. It's also acceptable. There are some things that you may want to start as transplants indoors first and then transplant them out to the garden. Things that we see often used as transplants, we see tomatoes, we see peppers, things of that nature. If you have really large seeds tend to be easy to start directly in the garden or in the raised bed. And then after you have everything planted, then you're going to add mulch. We'll put in usually a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch. It's important to remember when you're mulching that you need to keep the mulch away from the stems. It's also important to remember that you don't put the mulch over an area where seeds have been planted until those seedlings are up at least 3 or 4 inches tall. The reason for that is mulch has a tendency to act as a weed inhibitor. And so if you put the mulch over where you just planted seeds, the seedlings have a chance that they won't come up through the mulch. Here's an example of mulch sprayed around some beets. And it doesn't have to be expensive mulch either. You can use what you get from the city landfill if you would like. And then let's talk a little bit about container gardening. Container gardening is a convenient way to grow some of your favorite vegetables when your space is very limited. Believe it or not, you can grow quite a few different types of vegetables in just medium-sized containers. Carrots grow good in containers. You can grow lettuce. You can grow quite a few different kinds of herbs, spinach. All of those things work pretty well in containers. Things that maybe don't work so well in containers are vegetables that take up a lot of space. So maybe watermelons might not be a good choice for a container, but a lot of your other things that stay fairly compact are great choices for containers. Some advantages include that they're easier to control the diseases and pests. It's easier to keep the weeds out of them. It's less work. You don't have to bend over as far to tend to them. And it's a good substitute if your drainage is really poor. Here's a picture that shows some examples of different containers. You know, if you're going for something that's really beautiful, then maybe you don't want to use old recycled containers. But if all you're doing is just trying to be productive, then old trash cans work. Buckets work, 5-gallon buckets work pretty well. I know we used to save all of the feed containers that they used out on the farm. They were big containers that they would get salt licks and stuff in, and I would drill holes in the bottom of those and use those. So there's no limit to what you can use. The important thing is to remember that they all have to have drainage, so you're gonna have to put some holes in the bottom of them to make sure that they drain and don't hold water. Here's some other containers, some unique things that I found online. You can actually use old tin cans to do transplants and get them started. And then somebody's used a bathtub down here on the left-hand side. And then I guess somebody likes the Medusa look, so they used a bunch of different heads that had planters. Somebody used the hands, and then there's rubber tires that they painted and stacked on top of each other and made a garden out of it. So
It looks cool.
pretty unique.
Mhm.
Here's some other examples. Somebody, I guess, had a Volkswagen that no longer ran, so they just turned it into a garden. An old potty chair, a pair of boots. I guess somebody didn't want to wear their brassiere anymore, so they used that. Some high heel shoes and a toilet. I'm telling you, people are very creative when it comes to containers. You can even make paper pots. It's easy to make a paper pot. All you have to have is an existing pot, and you just take paper, roll it around the existing pot or even a cup, and then you just tape it into place, and then slide it off and fold the bottom under and tape it in place, and you've got a paper pot. These are very good for transplanting because you can transplant the whole thing right into the ground and not have to worry about trying to get it out of the pot. So you don't even have to have pots that you purchased. You can make your own. Any questions?
I do. I have one. Mr. Gibbs, one of the biggest problems we're going to have is with these raised beds and vegetables is keeping possums and rats out of it. Is there any way we can, like, what's the best way to kind of like, well, keep them out? Can we put some type of wiring around it, or?
You may want to consider putting up a fence and fencing in the area. At least you're lucky enough that you don't have deer in there. There's a lot of places that they have trouble with deer coming in and eating their stuff. I mean, Flower Bluff is one place that comes to mind where the deer frequently come in and invade people's gardens. But yeah, you could put up a temporary fence around it pretty easily, I think. Probably just using T-posts and a fine grade chicken wire that's narrow enough mesh that they can't get in there. You would just have to hook it down on one end and make it where when people are going to go out there and work in the garden, it's easy to open up.
Okay. Yeah, I think
there's some ways. I mean, if you want to be permanent fencing, you could always have the maintenance staff put up some permanent fencing around it. In that area that I'm thinking of, though, you could almost just put fencing across one end from building to building, couldn't you?
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah. So it's something that we can figure out.
Okay. And they don't, I mean, does it happen where they climb the fencing? Is it a?
They're capable of climbing the fencing, yes.
Okay. All right.
There are some other things that you can put out. There's a product called Blood Meal that is just basically decomposed blood that's been dried, and it's good for the plants, but there's a lot of the animals that don't like the smell of it, and so that can be used. It's a natural fertilizer for the plants, but it's a natural deterrent for some of those animals as well. And then there are some commercial products out there too that are said to keep animals at bay.
All right. Okay. That was the only question I had.
All right. I don't know who our MAP staff is, so
That's Mina.
Mina,
I don't have any questions. Thank
no
you.
questions? All right. Well, this was nice and short and sweet, so I think we'll get there eventually. We're trying to, I may have to double up one of these weeks to try to make it through a couple of these so that you guys can get on track for planting, because really you ought to be considering if you want to make raised beds or what you want to plant. You guys really ought to be sitting down and thinking about that probably in the next week or two.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.